Always, I'm Dr. Sean Hashmi. This is Self Principle. That's Sleep, Exercise, Love, Food. That's my nonprofit. Always remember, this has nothing to do with my day to day work. This is just part of my contribution to making sure you guys get to hear about the latest and greatest when it comes to the science of nutrition, fitness, health, longevity. So today's topic is about longevity, and what we're going to focus on is talking about what gives you the best odds at living healthier and living longer. In other words, when it comes to comparing the most popular diets, we're going to take a look at keto, we're going to take a look at Mediterranean, we're going to take a look at fasting. And the goal is to present you the data to help you decide what makes sense for you and how you can incorporate the principles into your own life to be able to live longer and healthier. Now, when we talk about this concept of longer and healthier, remember there's a difference between lifespan and health span. And as obvious as that sounds, a lot of people are very obsessed with a number on how many years I'm going to live. I would argue that health span is much more important. And health span, basically, the concept is how's your physical being? How's your mental being? How's your ability to communicate? It's not just about not having a disease. It's about can you live to your optimal potential? And that's basically the idea of health span. So, when we talk about today's topic, we'll start with the basic concept of just cutting calories. And then after that, we will go dive into a little bit more from calorie restriction into things like intermittent fasting, Mediterranean diet, and ketogenic diet, and try to explain what are the pros and cons of each specifically around living healthier and longer. So, when we take a step back and start to think about this concept of aging, what's really interesting is there's really a couple of key molecules that you want to know about. There's a protein kinase called mTOR. And if you haven't heard of mTOR, the mammalian target of rapamycin, it's been everywhere. So many folks talk about it. There are so many papers talking about it. And basically, what mTOR really does is it controls metabolism, it controls catabolism or breakdown. It's involved in how your immune responds to things. It's involved in how we basically do something known as autophagy, or basically clearing out the debris. It's kind of like cleaning your house or cleaning your garage every so often. It also looks at how it keeps all of the cellular functions in line so nothing really gets out of balance. Now, in this particular talk today, we're going to talk about mTORC1 and mTORC2. And the reason this becomes important, we started with talking about mTOR, and we're breaking that down into two things, mTORC1 and mTORC2. So mTORC1 is the one that's really critical for essentially the survival of cells, cell growth, for cleaning out your garage, where mTORC2 is what's involved essentially in other functions, but more crucially in insulin signaling. And we're going to get to this idea of why insulin becomes sort of the very key point that you want to look at more so than anything else. So, that being the case, what we end up finding is that in terms of all the studies out there, you will find that when it comes to health span, just cutting calories, in other words, dietary restriction of how many calories you're consuming, is actually the biggest aspect of what helps you to extend your lifespan and delay the onset of all sorts of chronic illnesses. So once again, of all the things we talk about, dietary restriction has the most data, and it turns out that it's all of the other diets we talk about. Now, in terms of calorie restriction, we know that there are so many pathways that it's going to end up working through. What we're talking about the fact that cutting calories reduces oxidative stress, reduces inflammation, over time reduces the gut bacteria. It also ends up helping those cells that are dying to essentially get cleaned out of the system. And what is central to all of this? Once again, is mTOR. mTOR becomes very important to understand in terms of all of these things. Then we start to talk about a very popular type of diet, and that diet is intermittent fasting. Everybody's heard of intermittent fasting. There are a ton of videos that I've already done on it, so we're not going to go into detail here. You can look at the channels, watch all the previous videos on fasting, but what is important to understand about fasting is that intermittent fasting can actually start to influence all of your energy pathways. And it also starts to directly affect the mTOR pathway. So, in other words, because mTOR and your energy pathways are so important in aging, there's actually a direct link on how intermittent fasting is affecting it. But if you go from fasting, which is a form of calorie restriction, because you are reducing the time and it will lead to you cutting out some calories. But then if you look at something like a Mediterranean diet, there is no calorie restriction. So what gives? How is a Mediterranean diet linked to more lifespan and more health span? Well, it turns out that the Mediterranean diet, which is essentially a plant-based diet with things like olive oil, fish, etc. So when we start to look at a Mediterranean diet, its content of all of its antioxidants, it's rich in omega-3 and all of those fruits and vegetables, nuts, seeds, all those great things that you're getting, they add up to being anti-inflammatory. Reducing the oxidative stress on your body allows you to avoid illnesses, allows you to live longer. But then let's take it to the extreme and talk about the ketogenic diet. So when we talk about ketogenic diet, there's a lot of stuff we've talked about in the past: migraines, seizures, Alzheimer's or dementia, and how it can be very helpful if you know what to watch out for, how to do it better. So in other words, it's not talking about eating bacon all the time. It's talking about healthier fats and reducing carbohydrates in a supervised manner. So we know that the ketogenic diet has all of these neuroprotective effects. And it also, in addition to all of that, it focuses on the production of ketone bodies instead of things like glycolysis. And the reason that matters is because those ketone bodies are the ones that are going to the brain and doing all sorts of awesome things that we have studies about. The other part of this is as you start to switch towards ketone bodies, and it takes weeks. So, people do a ketogenic diet and they're like, I did it for 1 week. No, it takes 4 to 6 weeks at a minimum for your body to start to adapt to ketosis. And so ketosis is not something that's going to occur right away. The full benefits are going to be weeks into it. And that's why if you started, you got to know that you got to be able to stick with it. So what happens is, as you start to do a ketogenic diet, you start to see that your insulin sensitivity comes up. You have improved ability to handle any sugar that's in there. Your mitochondria starts to work better, and you start to have autophagy, or clearing out your garage. All of those things end up in ketogenic diet, and that's how, because of the improved insulin sensitivity, the improved mitochondrial function, the improved autophagy, that's how you're starting to see in a ketogenic diet that there's longer health span and lifespan. So bottom line here is, when you talk about healthy aging, there are so many diet wars. Everybody is an expert. If you talk to one person in one camp, they will tell you their diet is the absolute best, nothing else compare. But it turns out that's not the case. So we're talking about calorie restriction. We're talking about fasting. We're talking about Mediterranean diet. We're talking about ketogenic diet. And what we're saying is that all four of them can actually lead to healthy aging if you understand what they're doing. And that's what we're talking about, is understanding, so you walk away with this. So let's dive into calorie restricted a little bit more so you have some very specific information on it. So, in other words, when you talk about calorie restriction, it's not going out and starving yourself, it's still assuring that you're getting all your adequate nutrition, your vitamins, your supplements, all of that stuff is in there. But what you really want to understand is that when we start to look at data, there is so much data out there on calorie restriction increasing lifespan. Now, in non-human studies, when you look at budding yeast, when you start to look at fruit flies, when you look at nematode worms, there's plenty of data that shows that they live longer. That doesn't mean that that would apply to humans, but that's talking about non-human models as far as that goes. But then there are studies that have been done in humans. There was the Calorie trial, and this randomized 220 non-obese adults to either cutting down their calories by 25% or, of course, maintaining their current diet for about 2 years. And what they were able to show was that calorie reduction folks actually had a significant reduction in how the markers for biological aging were increasing compared to those who continued eating what they normally ate. And this becomes important because what they saw was that those who were eating their normal meals in this study, their biological age was increasing by 0.71 years versus those who just cut out their calories by 25%. They showed an increase of only 0.11 years. 0.71 versus 0.11 years. And this is fascinating because this wasn't like some crazy diet. All they did was cut out their calories by about 25%. In some people, that could be as much as you just cut out dessert. And if you did that, that in itself could make a huge impact. And what you find with calorie restriction is, once again, at the cellular level, you have a reduction in mTOR1 activity. Once again, mTOR is very important to our overall aging. You want to reduce mTOR to be able to improve your health span. And so with calorie restriction, that's exactly what's happening. Your mTOR1 activity is going down. The other part of this, as you start to think about calorie restriction, there's still a decrease in protein intake because the overall calories are going down. And a reduction in protein intake will also reduce mTOR, specifically mTOR1. So that will happen as well. And then, of course, there's the role of insulin. Anytime you reduce your calories, you're going to end up reducing insulin. You're also going to reduce IGF-1. And both of these are major activators of mTOR. So once again, a lot of what we're talking about today is going to come back down to the role of insulin. Insulin, insulin, insulin. So keep these two words in mind: mTOR, insulin. Insulin will turn on mTOR, and what you want to do is turn down mTOR. That's your goal. So as you start to think about just calorie restriction, you can see how the pathway is very clear. The other part of calorie restriction is that it's going to turn on the AMP, or activated protein kinase, AMPK. And as AMPK goes up, it's going to help your overall metabolism. So this is why calorie restriction becomes interesting. Now let's shift to intermittent fasting. Well, once again, in animal studies, if you start to see C. elegans, Drosophila, it's called melanogaster, if I'm saying that correctly. In those ones, there is increase in lifespan with fasting, but in mice and rodents, there is no increase. So in other words, with intermittent fasting, it's not as clear cut as it is with calorie restriction. But you are still seeing benefits when it comes to mTOR with fasting. So another study that was done, this is 60 healthy individuals. They were between ages 48 to 52. BMI was 25 to essentially low 25s and a little bit higher than that. They put them in two groups. One, they did alternate day fasting for 4 weeks. The rest, they continued to eat how they were eating previously. And then what they did was they took 30 individuals from another group of people and they had them do alternate day fasting for more than 6 months. And in this phase, when they were doing fasting, they were actually doing 36-hour periods where they weren't eating calories. So that was their fast day, was more than 24 hours. It continued until 36 hours. And then they had 12 hours of where they could eat whatever they wanted to do. And so the overall calorie deficit in this study was around 37%. And what they found was that there was decreased levels of something called CYCAM. It's just a biomarker. And what you see with this marker is that this marker goes higher as you have more inflammation and as you have more chronic diseases. And so the levels of CYCAM actually went down. And that was very helpful. The other thing was there's an amino acid, methionine. Methionine is a pro-aging amino acid. So in other words, it's linked to increasing those activities that cause us to biologically age a little faster. And once again, with fasting, you see a reduction in methionine as well. So in other words, in addition to fasting where you get, losing fat, you're able to lose weight, your blood pressure is going down, your cholesterol is going down, all those things are happening, but you're also getting these longer effects that are linked to aging, which is lower levels of CYCAM, lower levels of methionine. So all of this matters, but most importantly, this idea of intermittent fasting, you will find that you will have so many improvements in insulin sensitivity. Once again, what's the worst thing when it comes to aging? It's having insulin. And so the more weight you have, the more insulin resistance you get, the more insulin floats around your body, which will turn on mTOR. You don't want more mTOR. And so it's an interesting concept with fasting is that by putting yourself under a little bit of metabolic stress periodically, you actually end up improving your overall health. One more time, if you go ahead and put yourself under stress periodically, you're improving your overall health. So when we talk about stress, what's another form of stress? Exercise, right? When you do exercise, you're putting your entire body, the metabolic processes, under stress, and that in return leads to living longer. So it's pretty cool that fasting has all of these cellular mechanisms that are actually quite robust, and in many ways they are stronger than calorie restriction. And so if you were to look, what happens downstream is you'll see things like heat shock proteins go up. People always talk about cold baths. I talk about saunas because they both do the same thing. Cold shock proteins or heat shock proteins both have so many benefits. If you're somebody like me who actually can't do cold, or God forbid you suffer from Raynaud's or something, then cold baths are out of the picture. If that's the case, don't worry. Saunas are still very helpful. But this concept of controlled periodic stress is what makes intermittent fasting so cool. But then Mediterranean diet, based on everything we're talking about, is calorie restriction, is a little bit of stress. Why the heck would a Mediterranean diet lead to longer health span and longer lifespan? And so what's interesting about Mediterranean diet is it is the most documented diet out there. There are more studies about Mediterranean diet than just about any other diet out there. So just to give you some studies. So there's a study where they looked at around 1,300 people. They were about 65 to 79, 5 European centers. They divided them into two groups. One followed essentially a Mediterranean type diet. The other followed their regular intervention. And what they found was that those who followed the Mediterranean diet, they were able to change the bacteria in their gut. This is critical because the inflammation in your gut directly leads to insulin resistance. So, what they found was that not only the bacteria in their gut changed, they also had lower markers of frailty. They were able to be more mobile, they still retained muscle, they had better brain health overall, and their markers of inflammation. Once again, poor gut bacteria means more inflammation. Better gut bacteria means lower levels of things like C reactive protein or CRP or IL-17 or interleukin 17. So you will see that with the Mediterranean diet, even though we're not really cutting calories, we are lowering the overall oxidative stress, we are lowering the overall inflammation, changing the markers inside your gut. And the reason for it is because the Mediterranean diet is nutrient dense. It's high quality foods rather than trying to cut your calories. So in other words, if you're somebody who says, okay, that's great, I don't think I can cut my calories. Got it. If you can't, let's focus instead on something like a Mediterranean type eating style. Because what you'll find is that Mediterranean diet, it's got lots of healthy fats or the unsaturated fats. It's got a ton of antioxidants. And guess what all of them do? They go ahead and make your insulin sensitivity better. They improve your endothelial function, and they end up turning down mTOR1. So altogether, even though it's not calorie restriction, it's still really, really good. And don't forget, a Mediterranean type diet is rich in what? Fiber. And fiber is going to go ahead and support the bacteria in your gut. It's going to help to produce more short chain fatty acids. And those short chain fatty acids are very important in terms of activating AMP kinase. And so you're getting the benefits of calorie restriction, of intermittent fasting without having to do either. Now, ketogenic diet. So ketogenic diet, what's interesting once again is you can't do it short term and affect or hope to get results from it. With ketogenic diet, you're going to have to do it for quite some time. So for your body to start adapting, you need to do it for weeks on end. There's a lot of data about can athletes do it? And the answer is yes, but you have to adapt. So if you go on a ketogenic diet 1 month, 2 months before you got a jiu-jitsu competition, that's the worst idea ever because you're going to have no energy. Your body systems have not adapted yet. You can certainly do ketogenic diets. You can do modified versions where you have more carbs on days. You're going to have intense jiu-jitsu practice. So there's ways to modify it however you want to. But ketogenic diet also extends lifespan and health span. And part of it is in my studies, you can see very good data on how it's able to prevent the decline in their cognitive function over time. And part of that is, once again, a ketogenic diet can actually affect mTOR1's signaling mechanisms. Not only that, it's reducing the overall blood sugars, it's reducing insulin levels, and insulin levels or insulin directly drives mTOR activity. You drop insulin, you decrease mTOR1. And as a result of it, once you decrease that mTOR pathway, you're able to create all of these wonderful things, including things like autophagy, things like cell turnover, decrease oxidative stress. All of those things are going to start happening. So when you think about this whole picture, if you drop mTOR, you're going to increase lifespan. But if you continue to eat all of the wonderful junk foods that's available to us, the cookies, the cakes, the sodas, all those things that we do on a regular basis, you're going to find that you're going to have much faster tissue aging. For those who are worried about their vision, yeah, there's higher risk of cataracts, there's higher infections, there's more bone loss because of the fact that mTOR is turning up. On the flip side, if you can turn it down, your lifespan and your health span are going to go up. So now, if you're listening so far and you're wondering, that's great, you've talked about 4 different things: calorie restriction, keto, Mediterranean fasting. Which one should I do? The reason for presenting it this way and giving you 4 options is so that you can understand that you can do the version that's best for you. At the end of the day, what we recommend and what I've talked about now for years is to follow 4 basic rules: is sleep 7 to 9 hours, is to exercise every day and do resistance training or weightlifting at least 3 times a week, is to love more, practice gratitude, kindness, work on your own stress, and eat more plants. If you do the eat more plants part, you can easily, for the rest of it, you can do fasting with a Mediterranean type diet. You could do a ketogenic diet and modify it. So once again, predominantly plants, healthier fats, right? You're not doing the bad fats. You're not doing bacon all the time. You're doing healthier fats. If you're somebody who wants to be completely vegan or a completely whole foods plant-based person, you can do that and take a look at calorie restriction or fasting as an added component. But don't make this complicated than it has to be. The best strategy to reduce aging is still sleep, exercise, love, and food. And for food, it's a predominantly whole food diet. Predominantly meaning 50% of your plate is fruits and vegetables. 25%, if you're going to do Mediterranean style, is complex carbs, and 25% is protein. That's a very simple way. It's like those old Dixie plates. It's a very simple way to remember things. All right, so with that concludes the teaching portion. Now we're going to take your questions. So whatever your questions have, pop them in the chat and we'll get through it. So let's see. Din asked the question, hi, Doc, is it true Ozempic causes liver damage? No, Din, in my clinical practice, which is kidneys and, of course, it's lifestyle and obesity medicine, I do a lot of prescriptions for Ozempic, and I've not had a single patient with issues around their liver, knock on wood. But of course, all of our patients are told upfront not to drink alcohol, right? We're worried about pancreatitis and so forth, so we make sure that they don't do any of that. Somebody asked a question, is there any proof that water fasting reduces loose skin for those who have large amounts of weight to lose? The answer is absolutely no. Whoever came up with that myth, it is unfortunately nothing but a myth. Just remember, if you do water fasting, there is a concern for things like hyponatremia. So if you're only putting back water in every time you pee, you're never just peeing out all water. There's some amount of solutes. So the danger with prolonged water fasting is if you're not getting blood tests and you're not under the supervision of a doctor, you can actually get into trouble. Then the question was, let's see, there's a question from Instagram, which is how much fat is required for our brains? This is a really interesting and complicated topic, because when you start to look at around what makes sense for carbohydrates, well, it ends up being that carbohydrates is around 40 to 60% of your diet in terms of overall health. We're not talking about a ketogenic diet, we're just talking about where that is. In terms of protein, if you're looking to build muscle mass, the optimal amount of protein is 1.2 grams per kilogram per day to 1.6 grams per kilogram per day. Remember, this is not based on your weight. It's based on your ideal body weight. And so that's how much protein. And then what's left over should be your healthy fats. Now, if you're on a ketogenic diet, of course, the predominant source of energy would be all fats coming in. Carbohydrates are very, very little, right? You're looking at less than 50 grams, in some cases less than 20 grams. It depends on whether you're adding in things like MCT or medium chain triglycerides or not. That's where it would make the difference. But overall, in terms of healthier fats, we can all do a better job. It's just that we're so obsessed with having too much fat in general that we get nervous about that. But there's lots of data on healthier fats, the monos and the polys, and we want to be able to understand that. Things like the avocado oils, the olive oil. So when you're making salads, think about those things in terms of being able to add that in there. Let's see. Does Ozempic help cardiovascular health? The answer is yes. Does Jardiance help kidney health? The answer is yes. So both Ozempic and Jardiance, if you guys don't know, Ozempic is a GLP-1 agonist. Jardiance is an SGLT2 inhibitor. Jardiance works by essentially making you pee out sugar. That's a very simplistic answer, but not to make it complex. So that's what's happening with Jardiance. With Ozempic, it's a GLP-1 agonist. It delays food from going through your stomach. It acts on the brain to make you feel less hungry. It makes the pancreas shoot out more insulin. So that's how it's going to work. The data shows there's the FLOW trial that I talked about, where Jardiance protected kidneys, and there was an additive effect of adding on a GLP-1 agonist like Ozempic. So in my clinical practice, I have patients who are already on Jardiance, can't go up anymore. I've added Ozempic and they were spilling a whole lot of protein, and I've been able to slow down their protein to less than a gram. Of course, other things matter. They can't eat really bad food while they're working with me, because then you're defeating the whole purpose of coming to see me. Let's see. Isn't there evidence that long-term ketosis increase all-cause mortality? I read ideally it should not be practiced long-term. This is an important question because the answer to that is tricky. It turns out that if you end up practicing long-term ketogenic diet, you have to worry about the potential risk of increased cardiovascular disease. This is why when we talk about a ketogenic diet, we're not saying you get to eat all the crappy fats in the world. What we're saying is think about the healthier fats. Think about the avocados. Think about the other things like olive oil. There's all sorts of options. Nuts. You're looking for healthier versions of fat, and you can continue that. You can also make it more sensible by doing modified versions where you have days where you're adding back carbs. For example, on the days that you're doing strenuous workouts, you can add those back in. There's a lot of people out there who are suffering from migraines and seizures where they've tried almost half a dozen to a dozen medications that haven't worked, that have added on a ketogenic diet on top of other things. And you can make it a plant predominant version. So if you want to look at it from that perspective. So the answer is no. You're looking at smaller studies that talk about that, but it's very hard for us to make those generalizations. Same thing with plant-based diets. When we say you're going to be protein deficient, or we say, your kids aren't going to grow to be a full age, all those misinformation out there is because people get afraid sometimes, and that's why. Let's see. Ozempic with gastroparesis, absolutely. Remember, it delays stomach emptying. So in the previous videos, I've talked about the fact that there are rare cases of permanent stomach blockage. That's what gastroparesis is. And then the final question before we stop for today is, which blood test do you recommend your patients pay attention to? So remember, blood tests are sort of like cursory. They don't give you the full answer of everything you're looking for. So if your blood tests are normal, that doesn't mean everything's okay. In other words, if your creatinine is normal, that doesn't mean your kidneys are healthy. It could mean that the damage isn't bad enough yet to show up on the blood test. So don't get into over-reliance. Make sure you're still doing all the healthy stuff. So things like your kidney function are important to check. If you have diabetes, especially more than 5 years, we get concerned about developing kidney disease from it. But more important than those is make sure that your blood pressure is in check, make sure that your weight is in check, and make sure that you're doing the exercise on a regular basis. And that becomes important. And then the last question, let's see, was whole food plant-based ketogenic diet will not carry the same risk as an animal version. So remember, when we're talking about an animal version, we're talking about not going down the road of all of those processed meats, all of those red meats, because of the heme content that we've mentioned many, many times. So just keep all of that information in mind. Never go to the extremes. There's a lot of people who have done a ketogenic type diet as a whole food plant-based diet. So don't discount it. But today's data is really to give you guys 4 different diets, 4 ways for you to be able to live longer and healthier. As always, I want to thank you guys so much. I know we went 4 minutes over, but I want to thank you guys so much for joining. I know you have better things you can do on a Wednesday, 5 o'clock. The greatest compliment you can ever give me is just to share these podcasts with your friends, your colleagues, have them come and check it out. And if there's topics you're interested in, let me know. And then I always leave you guys with the same saying, which is, if you could grow up to be anything in this world, why not grow up to be kind? This is one of those simple statements that every day I get reminded that a little bit of kindness goes a long ways. And every time I do something kind, you know, it's nice that my daughters get to see it. You may be jaded, you may have watched too much social media, and you don't think any of this is true, but just remember that none of this stuff we carry, we don't get to take it with us. The only thing that we get to leave behind in this world is how we made people feel. So please make people feel welcomed and loved. We need more of that today. With that, thank you always. I will see you guys next.